we've not connected in a bit. Last week was kind of a wash, what with Easter break started on Wednesday, and I know a lot of profs were either laying on the projects last week or they were just giving people the week off. So just sort of pulled back last week, and now we're going to use these final couple weeks to really focus in on practical rhetoric that we can use for ourselves. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this whole online adventure we're on that there's no way that we're going to be able to accomplish everything that we intended to do. However, there's a couple things that we can. We can narrow in on those areas where we can meet success. And really what I want is for you guys to leave feeling a little bit more confident with the language you use and how you put together arguments. And super impressed with your info, context, and causes speech. I'm sorry. I'm just going to be like fumbling over my words, drinking another cup of coffee here. But now we're going to think more and more about how do we now persuade somebody. We've helped them understand this complicated thing. We've given them these reasons of why it exists. We want to still draw from that same research. But especially as we've been looking at podcasts a little bit more, either at what is included in your own field or within the topic of your field, or even looking at podcasts that you like, we want to start thinking about like, cool, what does it mean to persuade somebody on something like this? Because if you are going to be delivering this in front of the class, even today's lesson and all of the lessons that we're going to have from here on out would look a little bit different. So there's been some adjustment on my part as well. So we want to strip things down to just sort of the basics of argumentation. A lot of this stuff you guys may know already, so forgive me for going over some of this. And then on Wednesday, we're going to look more at those strategies that I think will be especially helpful for podcasts. So I've been working pretty hard to try to edit those. So I have these sort of solid lessons for logical fallacies, for rhetorical strategies, and not all of those are going to work for the medium that you're using. So we're all adapting, but we can go back to the beginning of the semester with, adjusting for different audiences. And we know that there is sort of this period of bumbling or awkwardness that comes in trying to reach out or trying to alter your language for a different audience. So that's that spiel. For the next 3 lessons, we're going to have something like this where you're looking at a Prezi that I've recorded. I'm not going to make you stare at my face. That's the reason we're not doing Zoom classes. And so today's just going to be those building blocks of argumentation. On Wednesday, we're going to build on what are the strategies that work. And then next Monday, we're going to look at bad arguments and look at what are the naysayers in your camp saying? Like, how can you respond to those? Which I think next week, I love rhetorical fallacies because I, more than anything, want to be able to combat somebody who is arguing with me. I want to know what to say and not have that horrible moment where you're just sort of stuck and bumbling, or you throw out some like, well, you suck kind of argument. We want to seem informed. And so let's go to the basics. So this is a rhetoric class, which I almost thought about, let's show the Prezi from the very first day of class, but I don't want to waste your time any further. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So it's not just the language that you accidentally use. It's usually something that's more practice, that you've thought through, it's intentional, or maybe even not thought through, but it is intentional. And so the word rhetoric, I brought up my Twitter feed and I asked you guys to go on your Twitters and just type in rhetoric and see how it's used. And predominantly it's negative. We see rhetoric as something that's manipulative or lying, because there is this idea of like, oh, you're thinking about what to say. You're being like cautious about it and you're choosing your words carefully instead of just saying what you feel. So I think there's a really improper relationship we have with the word rhetoric, because rhetoric is just like, we persuade people all the time, but it's been very demonized as manipulation, and that's not necessarily what it means. I think looking at the word rhetoric right now is very fascinating. Just over the past couple days, you see a lot of headlines like this, shifting rhetoric around coronavirus. You see that with the president as well. Or I'll go back to that one in a second. Like this one, the invisible enemy rhetoric. So every time I just have like an alert on my phone whenever like a news article has a title for rhetoric, and then I go there immediately. Of course, it's always negative, but one thing that people are criticizing is that um, several months ago or several weeks ago, Trump was like, "Oh no, it's not a big deal. It's just like the flu." There's been a lot of interesting fallacies that we're going to examine next week. But with a phrase like this, because now he's going in and saying, "Oh, it's a pandemic," which of course it is. But you see that language changing, and that language is so powerful. And so this is a really unique time for us to be looking at language. While the virus itself is obviously the driving force behind how different our country looks right now, our world looks right now, it's the people who have power who are using language who communicate about the virus. We really only know what we know from either doctors or politicians. And so when I see something like this, strange invisible enemy rhetoric, it does impart this like this active choice of, oh, he's using his terms, carefully. um I'll go into more of that stuff later, but it's still very interesting to see how rhetoric is used in these phrases of like, oh, these politicians are trying to figure out what they're going to say. They're trying to persuade their audiences, their country, to either, give them higher approval ratings, or not to freak out, or not to completely tank the market. I don't know, but we're going to look at rhetoric today. Keep moving. So if we were in class, I would have you guys describe your argumentative style, because all of us argue differently. And it depends on who we're arguing with. There's some people that we're really successful arguing with. Of course, power plays into this a lot. So I, for one, am really, really good at arguing with service representatives in a nice way. I mean, more like on the phones, like credit card companies, things like that. Because I can sort of just go to the facts and like be authoritative and say, like, look, this is the way it is. But I am horrible arguing with my parents, even though I am by profession uh, an academic of rhetoric. I still find myself just sort of moving into this, I don't know, kind of emotional argument. And it never works. There's something about the connection that I have with my parents and the weird authority of, even though I'm in my 30s and I've not lived at home for decades, I still feel a discomfort there. And so think, as we're going through, what are the areas that you're really good at arguing, and what are the areas that you're not? Because what we're going to do on our discussion board after this is going back to this question, and then thinking also about like, what kind of arguments appeal to you? And that word appeal is really important when we're looking at formalized rhetoric. So, to just go back a little bit, rhetoric originated here in ancient Greece. And if we think about what kind of large political movement happened in ancient Greece, I hope you are immediately thinking of democracy. And some of the way that democracy was so different than oligarchy or monarchy or whatever, is that you have the voice of the people, right? In theory. Of course, people within ancient Greece was only people from a certain class who were, you know, Greek men. It wouldn't be people even from outside of Athens. They were considered foreign, and women and other people of color, slaves. Of course, they couldn't vote, but all the people otherwise. But when democracy started to develop, it was a massive change because it did shake up classes. Not that there was a class system that looks like what we have today, but there were like merchant classes, and so suddenly you have these people, let's say a fisherman and his family, a fisherman who's always just like fished and then like sent his fish to market, who suddenly has the opportunity to actually approach somebody, an elected leader, a chosen leader for his specific community, and air any grievances or have a voice in how he wants a community to be run, of course, within reason. And so most of the time, people who were in any class other than the very top were not educated formally. So reading, writing, things like that. They never had to address audiences, large audiences. And now you did. You had to be able to succinctly bring up your point. You needed to be able to address a large group of people and to convince them. And so basic supply and demand, because there was this skill that people needed but was not really widely available, all these different schools started to pop up all over. And it's kind of like different like tutoring schools, especially in like, I don't know, all around here, or I live in Orange County, and so I see them a lot down here, like Kumon or any sort of tutoring place for kids for SAT prep or whatever. There's those that are really, really good, and then there's those that are horrible and sort of cheap and janky. Um, and so it was the same thing. And so out of these different schools, you had some that were legitimately great. They had really talented, teachers, and some, were clearly people just trying to like get on the moment. Like when vape shops were opening all over, like just, oh, look, here's a space. This thing is selling well. I'm going to make some money. But because this is a little bit more philosophical, you ended up having sort of these whole movements and ideologies and philosophies come out of these different schools of rhetoric. So it's not just like a service, it was something where people were considering, what is our relationship to truth? To what level do we manipulate language, or do we stretch the truth, or do we wrap whatever the truth around whatever that is still like ethically okay? How do we weigh truth and weigh like winning this argument and doing better for the community? So it got tricky. It wasn't a normal business, and so we had these different schools. And I in our class we're supposed to be reading like Cicero and Quintilius and Plato. I'm not going to have you guys do that because those sort of texts are easy to talk about in class. So this is just going to take the place of you guys having to read that. But someday would be good. I recommend Aristotle. Aristotle is the OG for me. So one of the three main schools, and of course these were at sort of different times, is the Platonic view of rhetoric. And so most of us have heard of Plato. Maybe you took an intro philosophy class this semester or last semester. So Plato, I don't really like him. So he hated rhetoric, because rhetoric is just sort of this word that surrounds the actual act of doing it. It's a formalized, it's the art of that thing instead of just persuading. There's persuasion, then there's the art of persuasion. And so he saw rhetoric as dangerous, and because his whole thing was about truth, that you just have to pursue truth, and if you're stopping to think about how you're going to deliver that truth, there was something kind of artificial to him going on there. So he hated it, and he hated these schools. So he saw anybody who practiced rhetoric as just all they want to do is win. They don't want goodness, and everything's garbage, doesn't pursue it. And up here I was going to go off on a tangent about sophists, but sophists were one of the schools. It was definitely one of those schools that was like, hey, just like do whatever you want to win. Just like we'll teach you how to win. So it sort of they had the reputation of like bad lawyers, bad in the sense that they're just like slimy and they cheat their way through everything. And so he saw all rhetoricians as this instead of just the sophist. And actually that word still sticks around, sophistry. Stop your sophistry. So it's not that we use it that often, but we still use it for people who are basically just swindlers and liars. And he also hated that they ended up killing his BFF, Socrates. So, anyways, the school that I subscribe to is Aristotelian rhetoric. So, or Aristotle to me is that sort of original guy, and people don't realize that the way that we even organize thoughts, or the way that you construct a paper, or even that you unconsciously organize an argument, he was the first one to put all that down into writing, to say like, all right, I've observed what works and what doesn't work, let me just like make it official. And so he did. And so why I like him is that he thinks rhetoric is neutral. It's more of this force. So like the force in Star Wars, or like magic in Harry Potter, it's this thing that's powerful and you can do with it what you will. It does require training, though, and similar with Star Wars or Harry Potter. Like you need to be trained to use these forces, and however you're trained or whatever you believe in, you can end up impacting people for good or for bad, or it could be damaging to yourself or others if you properly handle it. So I like that because I like this idea of rhetoric being a tool. And so one of my favorite parts of his definition is that rhetoric is the ability to see in any situation an instrument of persuasion. And so I like that. That's different from the Platonic view where it's not this like large nebulous thing. It's like, no, it's this tool that you can choose to take and use. But when you're trained in rhetoric, you're able to see, you're able to confront a moment where you're arguing with your mom and see, oh my gosh, I know that I can persuade this person in this way. So that moment is rhetoric instead of just like, we're going to teach you the tricks in the trade or whatever. some water. So Quintilian and Cicero, excuse me, I'm taking a sip. This is where we get Jesuit rhetoric. So Quintilian and Cicero took this and made it a lot more um, philosophical, excuse me, in the sense that rhetoric is for the common good, and that when you are using rhetoric, it's this higher act, and you have this greater responsibility, and it's eloquence. It's where we get eloquentia perfecta, which is a big part of this class, perfect eloquence. How do we learn how to speak and write well for the common good? And so persuasion was like a dirty word for them. Rhetoric was this sort of higher ethereal word that we should be striving for, and not just for ourselves, which is what makes it different from sophistry. Anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to say about them to show you the difference. And so we're going to go back to Aristotelian rhetoric, and then we're going to go more into Quintilian and Ciceronian when we start to construct some solutions, or when we look at actually constructing our podcast. So many of you guys have seen this before. If you haven't, that's totally fine. Rhetoric used to be taught in schools up until the early 1900s, late 1800s. It was just as important as arithmetic and reading. And then when the Industrial Revolution came along, people didn't want to sit around philosophizing. They wanted more technical skills. They wanted, classes that helped them create businesses because of this rise of the middle class. And so rhetoric used to be something taught for like kids. And now many of us don't even get it until college. Or if you were like me, I didn't get it until like my senior year, which I think is bonkers because it would have helped me a lot. So Aristotle invented this rhetorical triangle. If you've been in speech classes, maybe you've seen this. If you've been in philosophy classes, maybe you've seen this. Maybe you're a really good English teacher, showed this to you in high school. But this is the triangle on which all good argumentation rests. I do not have the balls to go get a tattoo because I'm worried I'll hate it. But like, this is what I would get. It teaches us to balance three different important arguments that will shift in different weights. It also makes us think about some different points in the triangle, which are the speaker, the rhetor itself. The rhetor is the person who's speaking, and the material, how all of those are really balanced as well. So we'll look through all three of these today. And then we'll pick back up on Wednesday when we look at some strategies that help us achieve this in a really good way. So all of these are in the Greek. Logos, which is logic, anything that appeals to our sense of reason, anything that when we hear it, we're like, yeah, that makes sense. And pathos, which is empathy. So we interpret it as emotion a lot, but it's not just emotion, it's more of just humanity. If you can convince somebody, make them look at you as a human, or make them evaluate something from a point of humanity instead of logic, that can be successful. Of course, there's also just like making someone sad, etc. And ethos, which sounds like it would be ethics, but it's actually credibility, having authority, being credible. So we're going to look at these one by one, and the way that I learned these was through advertisements, because ads are the most bald-faced method of persuasion I think we have. The only thing it's convincing you to do is buy it. So we're going to look at those, and ordinarily we'd go through this and I'd have you guys analyze them, and it's a bummer because I think that would be more fun. But I'm just going to try to pull out a couple things from each to show you the different ways that ethos can manifest itself, that logos can manifest itself. And obviously we are not analyzing ads in our class, and we're not creating advertising, but the same things that we can see in ads, we can also pick out from arguments. And that's what we're going to do Wednesday, is start to pick out stuff from different arguments of how people are using ethos effectively. So there is a crossover. So when someone uses ethos, there's a desire that they have, and the rhetor wants to be seen as credible and an authority. It's super important. The way that we do this with writing or with speaking, we make sure everything's really polished and organized, because if you get up there to speak and it looks like you're disorganized, you lose credibility. The same thing with using respectable people to back up an argument. And respectable, I put in quotation marks, because it may not just be doctors and professors and people who hold really high offices. For some of you guys, like, think about who is credible. For me, somebody credible, I don't know, could be in a K-pop star on Twitter. That is a credible source because it's within the world of your source. So don't just turn to academic journals. Think about who holds authority or who is close to the information and has that experience that we trust. That can be very helpful. You can do this also by asserting your own experience and credentials. So many of you guys are really a part of your topic. So I think about Jared at the very beginning of his informative speech, said like, "Hey, this was my experience as a black kid, and having to like learn what my race was from my mom." So like there is authority there, and that's a strategy that we're going to look at on Wednesday as well. So some ways that we use this, whenever we try to cite something. So saying, "Oh no, it's true. I read it on BuzzFeed, not the most credible source, but still we're saying, look, I didn't make this up. I got it from somewhere." We're always just sort of doing this as backup. It's like, look at my backup behind me. It's not just me. I have this, this, and this that said that. Anytime you just sort of blindly reach for an authority figure. So if the RA, you use invoke the RA to turn down the music, which I definitely used in college. Even if I had not talked to the RA, that person holds more authority, and so the person who is arguing with you really can't say anything about it. I teach I teach at Biola also, and it is tremendous how many of my students have been broken up with this way. So even if you are very, very religious, please don't ever say, "God has just really put it on my heart lately that we should break up." This is a very poor use of ethos, for a lot of reasons. Of course, like God is the ultimate authority, but it's kind of it's a lame way to break up, because now you're sort of putting the blame on God. You're not taking responsibility. So all of these are just sort of pure ethos arguments. Most arguments are not, because they look ridiculous like this. It's like the "I'm telling" kind of, appeal. So most of the time, ethos should be interwoven with stronger appeals. But you need to at least show that there's that authority. But if you're not giving reasons, if you're not, providing evidence, if you're not explaining, then it's not useful. It's just tattling. So some examples and ads. Excuse me. I love this one because it's just chock full of it, and there's so many things that I just glide over. And this is one, obviously you have the authority of the dentist and a white coat. A white coat itself is this very authoritative symbol. There's been studies where one doctor will wear a white coat and one doctor will just wear a stethoscope around their neck with a name tag, and they both prescribe medications to two different sample groups. And the sample group who was prescribed by the white coat doctor ended up using their medication correctly and like almost to what the label said, whereas the other group did not. There are these just ingrained symbols of authority, that if we were continuing to read Blind Spot, which I'm really sad that we're not, but I recommend reading it. It talks about how we identify, these symbols early. Like, oh, find somebody in uniform if you get lost, find a police officer, find somebody so you know to go to them. So we identify authority pretty quickly. But I want to look over at the words on the right. So many of those are just infused with the sense of authority and credibility. Expert is there at the bottom. You have #1 dentist recommended brand for sensitive teeth. And then if we start to logically break it down, it's like, well, what does that mean that it's #1 dentist recommended? How did you get there? But it's not like we see the results of certain studies. This is like if you see like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend. I'm like, well, what about the one? But we see #1, we know that's better, and so it must be good. And there's a lot of things about better in here. So we have plus. So even though that doesn't seem like an authority thing, it is. It makes it seem credible that it has all these things. #1 dentist plus the gigantic plus in the middle, which we always want to look at what the rhetor is making you focus on, either in their argument, in something visual. So whatever they repeat a lot, that's really their focus. And I think my favorite thing down here is extra whitening. I don't know what extra whitening is, but it sounds good to us. Extra is more and more is good. And so we see connotation working really well. And of course, there's positive words in here too: relief, benefits, things like that. One other thing I want to draw attention to is just some of the visual aspects. The color is incredibly persuasive. If this was red or yellow, I don't think that it would have the same feel. There's even a shine on the font to the right. And the dentist herself has really white teeth. That adds to the credibility. And lastly, she's wearing a wedding ring. And that feels like it's a really small thing. But in our society, we value or we trust people who are in committed relationships or who are married. Even myself, if I'm seated on a plane next to somebody, and when I was younger, if they had a wedding ring on, I would just sort of feel safer, even though there's absolutely no reason for me to think that. But we have like, oh, the family man, oh, she's a mother of four, like we really hold that in high regard, and so even that subconsciously carries over into a sense of credibility. This is definitely an older ad, but this also deals with credibility. You don't see a dentist or a doctor, but you have words like official. You have these two names, brand names, and their logos. So logos and branding is a really big part of credibility. Dropping names, um, even though like. How does somebody become an official sponsor of a team? You pay a lot of money. So really them being official sponsor means nothing. There's no credibility there other than they just had money to buy somebody off. But it feels like something official. And looking at the image, I find this really fascinating because you're supposed to identify yourself as having that truck. It's right. I think that's center field. I don't know. And the lights are on. It's game day. You're in the action, and it makes me think about like gear that you have. If anybody supports a team, most likely you have like a hat or a jersey or something. There is this connection we have of ownership of I want to be a part of this team. I want to have something and show that I'm a part of this. And so they're kind of playing off of this there, where this truck is like the ultimate gear if you're really a fan. So God, car advertising is fascinating to me because it's always so boring, but there's all these tropes. And lastly, there's different kinds of credibility that aren't actually experts, but it's a group think. So we are very social creatures. We in group constantly. We are terrified of being in the out group because we're tribal. We grew up, our ancestors grew up in tribes and small villages. The idea of the metropolis like really didn't come into play until a more modern world. And so we're afraid we can be manipulated really easily by the whole everybody's doing it thing. That's why popularity trends take off so much. So this is completely playing off of it. If I'm trying to figure out why should I wear this mascara, I don't see any reason for that other than it's America's favorite. And if it's America's favorite, it should be good enough for me too. No wonder one is sold every 1.7 seconds. That creates urgency, makes it seem like, oh, everybody's wearing this. This is the mascara to wear. And lastly, just because I hate it, perfume ads are absolutely ridiculous. They're usually a combination of these three things: some celebrity in black and white, a giant bottle, and then some random word that means nothing. But if you think about why do I buy this women's perfume, you could logic your way around it and say, like, well, so that you could smell good enough to get Brad Pitt, and then that would be inevitable. But there really isn't any logic to it. It's purely supposed to grab you in by just having the face of somebody here. So this is what infuriates me with different like celebrities that are attached to campaigns, whether it be political or social justice related. It just is kind of a cheap shot, but it can be a false authority, but can be very emotionally persuasive in many ways. So what we can do uh, when we are trying to build ethos is bring in a trustworthy figure, persuasive figure, appeal to a sense of loyalty and personal identity. That's going to be something we're going to talk a little bit more about because I think that will be helpful for your podcast, especially you are a person talking to another single person, individual person, maybe not single, and appealing to collective identity. This we're all in this, we're all doing this. So even though that was bad for the mascara, that can be really helpful when you're trying to fight for social justice issues. Logos. So the rudder wants everyone to follow and understand an argument. That should be basic. If people aren't following along with you, they're not going to listen. And then what's the point of even speaking if nobody is listening to you? So, writers and speakers use it by citing facts and history and statistics. Our brain loves those. Using definitions where you're able to really control whatever that narrative is and saying, look, this is what this means. We don't have to have questions about it. It's cut and dry. Anytime we're making logical connections, explaining sequencing, very, very helpful. A lot of you guys did this in your informative speeches with a timeline saying this thing happened and then this thing happened and then this thing happened. Our brain really likes that, especially with cause and effect. And also finding ways to help the audience understand information differently, like through contrasts or descriptions. And I think I might actually save this for Wednesday because we're going to be talking a little bit about how to make people understand stuff better. So forgive me that I'm just going to do a lot of skipping over. We'll come back to those. And we'll actually move. Actually, you're getting some real-time thought process. I think we will. We've got enough stuff going on. Okay, I'll be quick though. So I want to talk about logical reasoning. Logical reasoning is hard to pin down because we're like, oh yeah, statistics, great, numbers. I can get why people trust that more. With logical reasoning, we want to be able to break things down into steps because we don't know what our audience will understand and what they don't. And so I just want to break down what logical reasoning is because it's a type of syllogism. So if you ever take a formal logic class, if you're a philosophy major, and you're probably gonna have to take one, it's like math problems, but with words and ideas, where you sort of stack them all up and you see what's missing. So if I make the argument it's only 8:30, so I can't go to in and out, there's a lot of assumptions I'm making about my audience, who are people who live in California or have lived in California. I'm going to guess that you thought it was 8:30 a.m. Because In-N-Out is a burger place, and most burger places aren't open at 8:30 unless they have a breakfast menu, which In-N-Out does not. You assumed sort of what In-N-Out was. You are maybe assuming, I'm assuming why I can't go in other than the time that there's an empty parking lot, that the store is empty in the first place. Like, what, we're missing something in here. It's 8:30 a.m. I didn't even add that before. So that means no In-N-Out for me. So what is B? That missing B is just that they're not open that early. That's it. But I didn't feel the need to add that in because you guys could follow along with me in the same way that I didn't even think about putting an AM. And clearly that was a little bit of a typo, actually, because you guys know, I know my audience and I know what I can skip over. It's like when you're talking to a good friend versus not a good friend, or when we talked about going between our mom and our grandma. For some of you guys, you just need to make a few more connections. If you're talking to somebody from LMU versus your friends back home, you may have to explain a couple things for them that they don't get. Whereas here, you could just say, oh, I'm going to the lair. Not now because we're quarantined, but eventually go to the lair. And so that's what we call logical reasoning. So if I say something like In-N-Out cuts their potatoes right in front of you, so their fries are so much better than McDonald's. I have so in there twice. That's not great. But in your head, I'm just going to give it a pause. Think about what I assumed by saying this. What's in the gaps there? That if you were a space alien that came down, maybe wouldn't understand. So hopefully you've thought. I was going to make you guys write down answers. I'm like, they're not going to do that. So there's quite a few. Some of them are really basic, like potato fries come from potatoes. I didn't make the connection and say that, but I'm assuming my audience is going to get that. Also, just the assumption that fries that are cut in front of you are fresher. So I said, oh, they cut them in front of you, so they're better. So I didn't even say fresh, but I think that's what most of us were thinking. Maybe taste as well. But if they cut their fries in front of you, obviously that's going to be more fresh than a place that doesn't. That's so basic because we already know that. I didn't have to say it out loud. This looks ridiculous from here because you're like, yeah, of course, you already mean these things. But we want to be able to break these these things down and see what assumptions did I make. Um, Even just the idea of freshness being better. I'm sure you thought freshness, many of you, and that took the place of better, even though I didn't say it. And I didn't say how McDonald's deals with their fries, but I think we assumed from this that they do not cut their fries in front of customers and that they then don't have fresh fries. So there's all of these things that went unsaid because I could do it. And that was fine for now. But again, if the space alien came down and I delivered this sentence, they would have no idea what I'm talking about. And then I basically lose because I wasn't able to communicate. So, although this is ridiculous, we want to keep this in mind when we're trying to convey a point of what kinds of logical assumptions might I be missing out on just because I know a lot about this. So, this happens a little bit more in writing than it does in speaking because you don't see your audience in front of you. But I do teach writing. And I cannot tell you how many times I have to write the comments. What do you mean here? How did you get here? This doesn't follow. This doesn't make sense. How did you make that assumption? Those how, why questions that we want to premeditate about our audience. And so while you don't need to break things down so that you're talking to an alien, you do want to think about your audience who may not know anything about the issue that you're researching. Other ways we use this. So, this classic Subway ad, where we have a couple elements of it. We have numbers in there. We have 245 pounds on 2 steps a day. We love numbers. We love specifics. Um, if you see, there's also like a little summary with a lot of details in there. The exact poundage, 6 grams of fat, less twice a day sandwiches begin in March 1988, a 6-inch turkey sandwich and a veggie delight sandwich. It gives a lot of concrete details. We tend to believe people more when they use concrete details. So I find this whenever people try to get out of class by saying that they're sick, they'll typically use a lot of disgusting, I think I told you guys, disgusting adjectives to like tell me what their sick looks like and what their skin rash looks like. And it makes me not believe them because it seems kind of artificial. You're trying to put all of this language onto a situation and make it seem visible. And I do the same thing. I think it's a very human element of, oh, I'm late because my car's lug nut was doing this thing. So we always go to those specifics because it seems like we're giving a snapshot. But that counts as logos when we give a lot of specific description. We also see a great element of logos, which is the before and after. You see the before and after with him holding the pants. We're just assuming those are his pants. We don't know that. They could have just gone to the Goodwill and picked some up. But our brain is saying, oh, look, he's smaller than those pants. And they're talking about him dropping all this weight. That we're seeing is believing. Here's the picture of him up in the upper left hand corner. That was him before, this is him after. This is why we love like beauty bloggers and things like that. We like to see the process happen and we believe it more. Here's another example of a couple things, but listing a lot of examples, a lot of descriptions. So obviously the whole argument is that you are smoking poison. And the irony is, oh, do you watch your intake? Normally we think about calories. We have a nutrition facts. Your brain is connecting those things, the logical reasoning saying, oh, they're trying to connect what I am smoking like with eating. I'm conscious about what I eat. So I should also be conscious about, smoking. It's kind of ridiculous if I'm watching my calories or watching my macros or whatever, and I'm not caring about what I breathe in. So that whole message is conveyed through logical reasoning. It's not overt. They're expecting you to do the work cognitively. And there's clever little things in there, the little like skulls off to the side for the percentage of deathly values. But there's a lot of emotion in here too. Even though this is a logos argument, a lot of these words are obviously scary. Some of them like arsenic, or DDT or formaldehyde, or like butane, chloroform. Those are things that we're like, yeah, those are real bad. Those are legitimately poison. Hydrogen cyanide. So it's supposed to evoke this fear in you, even though its primary form is logos. Facts and statistics and things like that can be tremendously emotional. And that's really what we want to be trying to find. Statistics that are good, that appeal to our brain, that when you hear them, you're like, oh my gosh, have shock or some sort of reaction there. This is obviously a very, very old one, but again, the comparison, look, this has more, this has less. Which one's better? The one that has more. Um, Seeing is believing. It can be used, obviously, really manipulatively. So this is sort of an interesting area between pathos and logos, but the they have 7 up on a tree. We suspend our sense of reality and disbelief because we're like, 7 up doesn't grow on a tree. That's ridiculous. But it's just meant to create the associations. This is what we could really do with connotation. You have all these words like freshness. It's stripped of artificial stuff. It's more lemon lime taste, 100% natural. I don't really know what that means, especially since it says more lemon lime taste and not more lemon lime. So it's all kind of a smoke screen that's supposed to associate it with something that's natural or as natural as fruit, even though it obviously isn't. So that's still logos, because it's sort of creating this this false comparison. And another example with no words whatsoever. I'm guessing you guys got what the message was, which is like verbal violence is just as harmful as physical violence. It didn't need words at all. It used these images and our brain created that argument. That's what logical reasoning does. It's not like we were really like, oh, wow, what an incredible photo. How he has an arm growing out of his mouth. Of course not. We see him screaming. We see her in pain. We see a common domestic abuse sign, which is grabbing the hair. And so we could put all that together and then make that argument ourselves. And a cuter one, because that was kind of rough. This parallel parking ad by Volkswagen, anthropomorphizing. Why am I struggling with that word? Turning them into animals. Is very clever because it's cute. It has that pathos appeal. It gets our attention. It's like, oh, that's an adorable porcupine. I want to pet it, even though it hurt me. We know this is for Volkswagen. We know it's about park assist. And so we look at this scene, which has nothing to do with parking, and we can associate that image of parallel parking. We can create the argument ourselves of, oh, clearly Volkswagen has really good parallel parking because we know that a porcupine is pokey, and we know that plastic bags are thin, they're full of water, and there's a dangerous situation where fish need water to live, and if they're popped, then it's going to be really bad, but everybody's sitting really comfortably, so clearly this park assist is good. And lastly, pathos. So the pathos, when you're using pathos, you want to connect to your audience. So you can do this in a lot of ways if you focus on the individual. So interviews are great. That is something that you can bring into your podcast if you'd like to interview somebody, either pre-recorded or you can have them sit with you. A story, in terms of tell a story or an anecdote, evoking universal human experience, because there are things that we all go through: life, death, birth, coronavirus, sickness, love, jealousy, hunger, marriage, all of these things are like, yeah, it doesn't matter where you're at, what life stage or whatever. These are things that every single human experiences at some level. And so if you're able to evoke that, kind of like what politicians do with family values, when they say, which I think I brought up in class too. So if a politician says, I believe in family values, even though it's a little bit of a Republican dog whistle, people hear that and they're like, oh, I value family. I think that families are valuable, and so I also agree with them. But it's so general. It's just meant to like grab at kind of everybody. Using loaded language or ideas. Talk about loaded language on Wednesday. You say humor, anger, disgust. If you bring in personal details or examples, or if you involve the reader or involve the speaker in some way, that's very, very helpful. One of my favorite examples, I actually heard at Loyola a couple years ago, and it has not left me. I was at the whatever that coffee place is, the Caribou Coffee, and at U-Haul, and I was sitting there, and there was a young lady on the phone with her parent, and this is not verbatim, but it's basically what she said. She was arguing with her parent, I assumed it was a parent, about needing the new iPhone because it has a way better map thing. She said her roommate got lost in like Skid Row the other night because her map sucked. And I was like, oh man, that's incredible. Like, that's horrifyingly manipulative. But she understood her audience. It was her mom. Let's say her mom or her dad. What do parents want most of all? They want their children to be safe. I hope so, if they're a good parent. So she knew how to sell this idea of getting a phone, correlating it with this fear, the essential fear for parents, even giving the name of Skid Row. You can't really get lost in Skid Row. Also, if you're driving through, nothing is going to happen to you. Even if you walk through, very little happens to you. And so it's the whole thing was just fantastic. But if she'd said, "Oh, I need the new iPhone. It has a way better camera." Like, that's not going to be as persuasive for the parent because that's not appealing to what that audience needed. Same thing happens with certain words. So if someone, your roommate says, don't go out with him, he's creepy. Creepy has this connotation for women. In the same way that I've heard crazy works with guys. If you label somebody as crazy, as creepy, you're not going to want to go out with them. But if you say like crazy to describe a guy for a girl, it doesn't really do the same thing. But there's no real argument here other than the weight of that word. There's no reason why he's creepy. There's no example of, look, he went out with Meredith and Meredith had this experience. There's nothing there. It's just really relying on the emotional weight of that word and the disgust and fear of rejection because the ew. I really love how we use pathos to change or to frame like maybe more negative things. So if you are thinking of how you want to deliver some news to somebody, you are considering pathos. You're considering their the human emotion attached to it of like, okay, I want to tell them to clean their room, but I don't want them to be mad at me. So I'm just going to add the LOL because that neutralizes it. Even though it is passive aggressive, at least you're not just saying clean up your side of the room and then that's it, because that would not be received well. You don't want to start a fight with this person. And so we do the same with emojis. Emojis are incredible uses of pathos, where you can literally change the entire meaning of what you wrote if you just use a certain emoji. It's fantastic. So some common ones will go by quickly. Obviously, the ones that pull at our heartstrings. This one, the predominant feeling is guilt. You could look at his eyes looking up at you. The rhetoric of charity organizations is really interesting because it's not a good argument. This like on a rhetorical level is not good. The only thing that's supposed to get you to give money is guilt, which I think we'd say is not like a it's not a capital G good argument, but it's for a good cause. Obviously, I don't really care, what kind of argument is used if it's gonna like get us to help people. It does call out how kind of messed up we are that we will usually only respond to things like this, that there is no logos. But even the bottom part, it's time to share. Even the use of share over give, I think is really interesting. Sharing has this connotation of like, you're not getting rid of it. We're taught to share when we're younger. Sharing is caring. And if it was just give, there's a sense of loss. But sharing, it's this idea of you're creating a relationship with somebody. So even just the use of that specific word is very fascinatingly intentional. A lot of PSAs use this. This obviously shock. Blood coming out of the phone when you look at the small letters says don't talk while she drives. And so if you use logical reasoning, the argument here is that you're complicit. If you're talking to somebody while they're driving, it's not just, don't text and drive. It's also, you on the other end, and you have a responsibility to keep your loved one safe. It's not just you. So effective because it is shocking and gory. Most of us saw the Kaepernick ad by Nike, which was made fun of a lot and just like subbed in different people with different captions and stuff. But this is interesting because on the surface level, it's like, oh, that is nice. Believe in something if it means sacrificing everything. That really doesn't mean anything, but it's one of those like feel nice statements. People use a lot of vague language for advertising because it's just supposed to make you feel good about it as you leave, so that you associate Nike with something good. But of course, there's added weight for those of us who know what happened to Kaepernick, that he, believed in the causes against police brutality, and then he literally sacrificed his career. So there is sort of this emotional statement it's supposed to make, especially because look, you're looking directly in his eyes. This is a very vulnerable, very intimate moment. You could see the pores on his face and his hair follicles. There, that intimacy, that humanity that's portrayed through this moment would be different if it was just like a black and white of him out on the field. Using positive language, especially tons of positive language in a row, has the same effect of just like, cool, when you leave this, you're gonna feel good. You're gonna associate the army with like strength and pride. So even just calling it army strong, they want you to associate those two words together. Having the image of the brother or the dad or whoever that is with the child who seems so proud of him, kissing his cheek, and he looks like he's just so satisfied. I have a lot of problems with the way that the military advertises. They do a lot of stuff that I'm like, this is very manipulative of, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. They have a couple where it looks like a video game simulation, and it's like, I just ethically don't think that that's right to do. I think there's other ways to recruit people. But being proud is strong, making others proud is army strong. So you have pride and strength twice each there. Then they're strong. Three, say four, five, 6, 7. So pride strong is in there 7 times. And we'll end on my favorite one. So this was a billboard that was outside of my office in Irvine for like 3 years, and they took it down last year, and I was devastated. So obviously it's a college campus, and this is for Planned Parenthood, but I mean, this is different from the ads that I see on the back of buses that are just like, I'm pregnant, I don't know what I'll do, and it's for like a teen crisis or like women's crisis hotline or whatever. Like, this is adorable. You have the IEDs at the top, and then birth control and condoms that are all like drawn in this sort of kawaii way. And it's hashtag squad goals, obviously a little bit dated. But if we think about the audience, college students, and you think about the message, which is they want people to use birth control and not just use it, like, try different ones that work, maybe even like feel a little better about talking to people about it, since it says squad goals, maybe insinuating you and your friend should be talking about it. And yeah, I just love it. It's hilarious. It's great. It destigmatizes birth control in many ways. And I've made fun of it forever, but I think it's just very lovely. So we will pick up on Wednesday looking at some specific strategies. This is just our little overview. And keeping all this in mind, I asked you to think about the way that you argue and what works for you. So head on over to the discussion board, and you can read that question below. I'll try to stop my recording somehow.